Today we are talking about how consciousness cannot have evolved if this is a material universe. And this poses an immense problem for science and those who subscribe to scientific materialism in particular, that thinks and posits that this is a material universe. We're going to see by looking at an article that was published recently why this is an impossibility and why it's no problem for our system, since our system is predicated on mind rather than matter. You guys like to, if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I like to show you guys when contemporary thinkers start to get close to what we have been saying for years. And this is, of course, another thing that we're going to look at today, as a contemporary thinker is getting closer and closer to what we have been saying, in that consciousness and mind is incompatible and impossible under a materialist paradigm. It's going to be good. So this article is titled "Consciousness Cannot Have Evolved." And of course, what we're talking about today is how consciousness cannot have evolved in a materialist universe. If the universe were material, there is a lot to unpack here, a lot of definitions to define. So let's dive in and we'll start to unpack it as we go along. So in a materialist world, in a world where there is only matter, consciousness cannot have evolved. The sooner we acknowledge it, the sooner we'll solve the hard problem of consciousness. Now, this was written by Bernardo Kastrup, who is a Dutch computer scientist and philosopher. The overwhelmingly validated theory of evolution tells us that the functions performed by our organs arose from associated increases in survival fitness. For instance, the bile produced by our liver and the insulin produced by our pancreas helps us absorb nutrients and thus survive. And insofar as it is produced by the brain, our phenomenal consciousness, our ability to subjectively experience the world around us, is no exception. It too must give us some survival advantage. Otherwise, natural selection wouldn't have fixed it in our genome. In other words, our sentience, to the extent that it is produced by the brain, must perform a beneficial function. Otherwise, we would be unconscious zombies. So what is this paragraph saying? It is saying that if we live in a material universe, and if evolution is true, then evolution produces those things which help our survival. And so, according to materialism and according to the theory of evolution within materialism, consciousness, to the extent that it would be produced by our brain, must have some sort of beneficial function, or else it wouldn't have evolved. That's the basis that we need to understand for understanding the ultimate conclusion of this article. Okay? Now, real quick, one thing that I want to make clear is that in mainstream science, they do not differentiate between consciousness, sentience, and mind. So in this article, whenever they talk about consciousness, whenever they talk about mind, whenever they talk about sentience, for them in this article, those are all different words for the same thing. In Hyperianism, that is not the case. Consciousness entails self-awareness. Mind is what is associated with what they are referring to in this article. So I just want to point this out for those who are familiar with Hyperianism, that in Hyperianism, what they are referring to as mind, or what they are referring to as consciousness, is what we refer to as mind in general. In mainstream science, they do not differentiate a difference between consciousness and sentience, which is really sloppy. You should, because they are different. In Hyperianism, sentience is just your ability to experience. When you experience pain, or heat, or cold, or love, that's sentience. Consciousness is the ability to self-reflect and have a metaphorical space where you can have self-awareness, create future scenarios, be aware of yourself, have a very well-developed ego, have a sense of I. That goes much further beyond just, oh, hot, cold, hungry, which is sentience. In this article, and in mainstream science, they don't differentiate, which is, again, very sloppy, but just FYI, keep that in mind, okay? So, our problem with this, the fact that if in materialism, evolution selects that for which increases survival, and therefore consciousness must perform a beneficial function for evolution to have selected for it. The problem with this, Kastrup is saying, is that under the premises of materialism, the definitions of materialism, what you have to believe if you believe that the world is material only, phenomenal consciousness cannot, by definition, have a function. According to, and if it doesn't have a function, then it couldn't have evolved according to natural selection. But let's continue. According to materialism, all entities are defined exhaustively, characterized in purely quantitative terms, quantities. For instance, subatomic particles are characterized in terms of mass, charge, and spin. Now, do you see how there's a difference between something like mass, charge, spin, length, weight, volume, and pain, pleasure, redness, love, will, anger? You see, there's a very big difference between pain, the experience of pain, and something like mass, volume, charge. And according to materialism, all entities are defined and characterized in purely quantitative terms, like mass, charge, and spin. Similarly, the behavior of abstract fields is fully defined in terms of quantities, such as frequencies and amplitudes of oscillations. Particles and fields in and of themselves have quantitative properties, but no intrinsic qualities, like flavors or color. Only our perceptions of them, or so the materialist argument goes, are accompanied by qualities somehow generated by our brain. Now just go with me here. If this isn't all clicking yet, it will. This is going to take a minute to unfold. Materialism posits that the quantities that characterize physical entities are what allow them to be causally efficacious, that is, to produce effects. For instance, it is the charge values of protons and electrons that produce the effects of their mutual attraction. In nuclear fission reactors, it's the mass value of neutrons that produce the effect of splitting atoms, and so on. Do you see? All of these causal effects, according to materialism, are caused by quantities, mass, charge. At no point does it take into account a subjective aspect or an inner aspect. It all has to do with external aspects, if you will. Whatever is not a quantity. Oh, and so all chains of cause and effect in nature, according to materialism, must be describable purely, only in terms of quantities. In terms of external properties, mass, charge, spin, etc. No internal properties. Internal properties being mind, what you are most intimately familiar with. Whatever is not a quantity cannot be part of our physical models, and therefore, insofar as such models are presumed to be causally closed, cannot produce effects. So, in essence, according to materialism, all functions, all things that occur, rest on quantities, external properties, not internal properties. This is going to be important. However, our phenomenal consciousness, the subjectivity that we experience, is eminently qualitative, not quantitative. We experience qualities. Our mind is associated with the experience of qualities such as hot, cold, red, love. You see, this is very different than, external quantities. But as we described above, one moment. Okay. There is something that it feels like to see the color red, which is not captured by merely noting the frequency of light. So if we were to tell Helen Keller that red is an oscillation of approximately 4.3 times 10 to the 14 cycles per second, she would still not know what it feels like to see red. So imagine, again, that you have someone that is blind, like Helen Keller. So Helen Keller is blind. So let's say that you tell a blind person, Helen Keller was also deaf, I think. So just imagine someone who is just blind. You go to a blind person and you tell them red is an oscillation of 4.3 times 10 to the 14 cycles. They know that information. They know that quantity. But they don't know the quality of seeing red. So do you see the difference between quantity and quality? Quantity would be an oscillation at 4.3 times 10 to the 13 hertz. Quality would be seeing the color red. You see how there is a difference. Now, they are associated, but there is a difference. Analogously, what it feels like to listen to a Vivaldi sonata cannot be conveyed to a person born deaf. But if we showed the person the sonata's complete power spectrum, but we could show them the power spectrum, right? So you could show them the power spectrum or even the frequency spectrum of Vivaldi, but they wouldn't experience hearing the music. So do you see the difference? This is going to be very important to our conclusion. Experiences are felt qualities, which philosophers and neuroscientists called qualia. And this is not fully describable by abstract quantities. But as discussed above, qualities have no function under materialism. Now this is really important, okay? Now and please pay attention, because so many people miss this point or think it's unimportant or set it aside. Even quote unquote intelligent scientists. So this is the crux here. Under materialism, qualities, seeing red, hearing music, have no function. For quantitatively defined physical models are supposed to be causally closed. That is, sufficient to explain every natural phenomenon. Materialism wants to explain everything in quantitative terms, not qualitative terms. As such, it makes no difference to the survival fitness of an organism whether the data processing taking place in its brain is accompanied by an experience or not. Whatever the case, the processing will produce the same effects. The organism will behave in exactly the same way and stand exactly the same chance to survive and reproduce. Qualia are at best superfluous extras. Therefore, under materialist premises, phenomenal consciousness cannot have been favored by natural selection, evolution. Indeed, it shouldn't exist at all. Let me explain this in case this is still a little muddy. Materialism wants to explain everything in terms of quantities. That is, all the actions that you take, they want to describe by quantitative physical processes, such as neurons in your brain firing, properties of charge, properties of interaction, properties of spin. In other words, they want to consider you and your brain like a computer that has been programmed. So let's think that materialism is true for a minute. I want you to imagine two people. One person is like a computer that has been programmed. It operates according to quantitative rules. Neurons firing in the brain, charge and spin. And I want you to imagine that, let's say that person gets their hand cut, and they pull their hand away from being cut. Now, why do they pull their hand away from being cut? They pull their hand away from being cut because they have been programmed, so to speak, to avoid something that would damage their physical body, right? That's why they pull it away. Let's say that they have no consciousness. They have no mind, they have no sentience. So they don't actually experience pain. They have no experience at all. Let's say they're completely like a dead computer program, but they pull their hand away anyway because that's what they are programmed to do. Now imagine another person that's the same, but also experiences pain. They do have a subjective experience, and they do have the experience of pain. So they also pull their hand away, and in addition to pulling their hand away, they internally experience pain. Now, if we were looking at these two individuals, staring at them, both of them would behave in exactly the same way. One would have an internal aspect, one would not. But they would both behave in the same way, according to materialism. Because according to materialism, everything is described or has a function via quantities. The electrons firing, the neurons firing, the neurons firing, the charge, the spin, all that. So according to materialism, both would behave in the exact same way. So do you see that with regard to materialism, consciousness serves no evolutionary advantage? Because consciousness, according to materialism, does not have an effect. It's just something extra that occurs, but you don't need it. And so it is not needed. Therefore, evolution would have no need to select for it, because evolution via natural selection under materialist premises selects for that which contributes to survival. And as we looked at the two humans who both pulled their hands away, they both behave in the exact same way. And according to, and if you're thinking, well, no, that doesn't make sense. Consciousness has to play a role. Yes, it does, but not according to materialism. That's why we say materialism is bullshit. It is illogical. It is primitive. It is full of holes. It is filled with gaps. It's filled with inconsistency. So if you're thinking that what I just explained to you doesn't seem right, that's because it's not right. What I'm telling you is this is what materialism claims when it's really understood. But this is why, one of the many reasons why materialism doesn't work and is a ridiculous system. So let's just continue. So under materialist premises, if you think that this world is material and follow out the premises and definitions to their conclusions, consciousness cannot have been favored by natural selection. In fact, it shouldn't exist at all. we should all be unconscious zombies going about our business in exactly the same way we actually do, but without an accompanying inner life. In other words, if materialism is true, everything that is right now should be exactly how it is right now, but we should have no inner experience of it. There would still be humans walking around. I'd still be doing this live stream. People would still be, everything that occurs right now would still be occurring, but there would be no mind. We'd all be like mindless robots. That is what happens when you follow materialism to its logical conclusion. That's the point. That's Kastrup's point in this article. Okay? Under materialist premises, consciousness cannot have been favored by natural selection. It shouldn't exist at all, and we should all be unconscious zombies going about our business in exactly the same way that we do, but without an inner life, without a subjectivity. If evolution is true, which we have every reason to believe is the case, our very sentience, our very subjectivity, our very mind contradicts materialism. Now, this conclusion is often overlooked by materialists, which basically means materialists, people who subscribe to the belief that the world is only matter, often overlook this. Why do they overlook this? Because they're usually philosophically illiterate and don't understand the conclusions that their own paradigm leads to. So, this conclusion is often overlooked by materialists because usually they're not philosophers. Anyway, they're usually scientists, but let's continue. Who regularly try to attribute functions to phenomenal consciousness. Here are 3 illustrative examples. Okay, so basically what they're saying is that most people who think that the world is made of matter don't understand what materialism actually implies, and they try to say that consciousness does have a function, that it does have a purpose, even in materialism. That's what they try to say, okay? So here are what they try to claim. That consciousness allows for attention, directing your attention. That consciousness enables and discriminates episodic memory from live perceptions, the present, by making them feel different. And that consciousness motivates behavior conducive to survival. So materialists will claim that consciousness does serve a purpose and that they serve these things, attention, discrimination, motivation for survival. However, computer scientists know that none of these things requires experience. You don't need this. You don't need experience. For we routinely implement all 3 functions in presumably unconscious silicon computers. So regarding point 1, under materialism, you know what? We still have a lot to read. If you want to read this for yourself, you absolutely can. But I want to get through this, and I have a lot more points to make, okay? So I'm going to skip a little bit. He's just showing how you can do all these things without... Here, I'll read the first one. Regarding point 1, under materialism, attention is simply a mechanism for focusing an organism's limited cognitive resources on priority tasks. And computer operating systems do this all the time, using techniques such as interrupts, queuing, task scheduling, etc., in purely algorithmic, quantitatively defined manner. Okay? So anyway, you can read the rest of the points if you want. So, just as these 3 examples illustrate, all conceivable cognitive functions can, under materialist premises, be performed without accompanying experience. Now, keep in mind, this is the point of view of Kastrup. I have problems with some of these conclusions, okay? Keep in mind that I don't agree with everything that Kastrup is saying here. However, I agree with his overarching conclusion to a certain extent. When we get to the end, I'll explain my point of view and how Hyperianism solves all these problems. So in other words, the so-called functions of consciousness aren't the cognitive tasks performed by consciousness, but simply those visible to consciousness, reported through conscious introspection. Why call these tasks the function of consciousness if they aren't what consciousness does, but merely what it sees? So, the conclusion here is that phenomenal consciousness cannot have evolved. It can have only been there from the beginning. Okay, let me repeat that. This is Kastrup's conclusion. Phenomenal consciousness cannot have evolved. It can only have been there from the beginning as an intrinsic, irreducible fact of nature. The faster that we come to terms with this fact, the faster our understanding of consciousness will progress. So Kastrup's conclusion refutes in his terms, contradicts materialism. Now, having looked at this, let's unpack this. So what is the gist, the main thrust of what has been described here, kind of a little recap, is that, hold on. So if you subscribe to materialism and therefore subscribe to a system where only only quantities serve as a causal mechanism and functions, an inner aspect would serve no function. And therefore, evolution and natural selection would never select for it because it doesn't serve a survival function. It doesn't serve a function at all. Now, let me say that there is a way, I want to be fair here, I want to be fair. There is a way for materialists to kind of weasel out of this argument. And the way that materialists could weasel out of this argument is by subscribing to something called emergentism. And what they could basically say is that, well, consciousness is something that emerges from a structure of matter, but it doesn't serve any purpose. It's just sort of a useless byproduct. So, some materialists, again, to try and get out of this problem, say that consciousness somehow emerges from the complexity of material structures, but that it is a useless byproduct, that it serves no function. It's a useless epiphenomenon of matter. In other words, everything that you're intimately familiar with, your hopes, your dreams, your feelings, all that is useless. It's just a byproduct. It serves no function. It has no meaning. It's an illusion. The fact that you feel pain when you're cut, it doesn't matter. It could be there or it couldn't be there. It just so happens to be the case that that happens to be a useless byproduct of an arrangement of atoms. So, yes, materialists can weasel their way out of the argument by claiming consciousness is an emergent, useless byproduct that is an epiphenomenon of matter. But that has its own huge problems. And the huge problems of that is that no logical or rational mechanism can be given whatsoever as how mind could possibly emerge from matter. That is a huge problem because it's a logical impossibility. It's logically fallacious. You can't have that is an intractable substance dualism here. You can't, anyway, I would go on way too long. But just so claiming emergence is like claiming a miracle. Oh, how did this happen? It emerged. It's like saying, oh, God did it. Because if you're going to say that mind emerges from matter, you better have a way that can logically or rationally occur, or else you might as well claim for a miracle. The second, another problem that it has is that it violates Occam's razor, since consciousness would serve absolutely no purpose. Why, if consciousness serves no purpose whatsoever, if it's just a useless byproduct, why would it be generated? This is a violation of Occam's razor, because it would literally, there would be no point, no reason, it shouldn't be there. So consciousness, mind, poses a huge problem for materialism for the reasons that, some of the reasons, not all of them, but some, because I do disagree with Kastrup on some points, but for some of the very good points that Kastrup brought up, that consciousness should have never evolved if it serves no purpose, and even if you take the emergentist claim that it's a useless byproduct, no logical or rational mechanism can be given for how mind could possibly emerge from the structure of atoms. And it's also a huge violation of Occam's razor, because there is no sufficient reason why reality would generate consciousness if consciousness serves no purpose and it's just some useless byproduct. And think about how insulting that is as well, that many scientific materialists claim this, that everything that you're intimately familiar with, your hopes, your dreams, your ambition, your will, everything, your loves, everything, it's just a useless byproduct, an illusion. It means nothing, and it is nothing. It's like exhaust fumes from a car, basically. Has no anyway, violation of Occam's razor, violation of logic and reason, hugely fallacious. Materialist, emergentist positions, hugely fallacious. Now, bringing in Hyperianism and ontological mathematics. You know how in materialism, things are purely in quantitative terms? In Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, we have quantitative and qualitatives. This is known as a dual aspect monism. That which exists has two sides to it, the inner and the outer. You see how materialism tries to reduce everything to outer? Now it can't explain the inner. It's failed because it's missing a critical piece. In ontological mathematics and Hyperianism, there is an inner and an outer. There is the formal aspect and then the qualitative experiential aspect as well. So for example, you can have a sinusoidal wave function, right? Imagine a sinusoidal wave, because in Hyperianism, everything reduces to sinusoidal waveforms. Technically monads, but monads are containers of sinusoidal waveforms, frequencies. So you can have a frequency that oscillates, you have a sinusoid that oscillates at a certain frequency. That is quantitative. But it also has a qualitative aspect to it, which might be the experience of red. So it has both. It is an information carrier, the quantitative aspect, and the information carried, the qualitative aspect. In Hyperianism, frequency, mathematics, the essence of existence is alive. That's why understanding ontological mathematics is completely different from how abstract mathematics is taught in school. In abstract mathematics taught in school, it's purely quantitative. In Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, mathematics is alive. It's frequency. It has an outer aspect and an inner aspect. And the reason, so in Hyperianism and ontological mathematics, consciousness and mind absolutely serve a function. Absolutely serves a function, and mind has both an inner aspect and an outer aspect to it. Mind is not just inner, nor is it just outer, it's inner and outer. It has a quantitative aspect, such as sinusoidal wave functions oscillating at a certain frequency. But you experience those wave functions as the world around you. The experience of the world around you is what it is like, the qualitative experience, what it is like to be a mathematical being experiencing mathematical functions. The experience of the world around you is what it is like to be a living mathematical being experiencing living mathematics all around you, which both has a quantitative and qualitative aspect. The information carrier, the waveforms, and the information carried, what it is like to experience those waveforms. So ontological mathematics doesn't have the problems that materialism has, that cuts out the inner aspect of reality. In Hyperion and ontological mathematics, it is a consistent, closed, perfect system that unifies both the inner and the outer and shows that reality is not a reality of matter. It's a reality of mind, and mind can experience itself in different ways. It can rationally understand itself and understand reality in quantitative terms, and it can experience itself as the world around you. Just like when you go to sleep and experience your dream world, that is your mind that has externalized itself, or in Hegelian terms, mind that has othered itself. And all that means is that you, as a mathematical entity, are having a what it's like, a qualitative experience of mathematical frequencies that you can understand in quantitative terms, sinusoids oscillating at a certain frequency, Fourier transforms, or qualitative terms. Quantitative terms being the oscillation in frequencies, qualitative terms being the sight of the world around you, the pleasure of listening to music, the pain of a cut on your hand, the feeling of love. This is living mathematics. It was Leibniz, one of the inventors of calculus, that said, I'm paraphrasing here, but music is the pleasure that one experiences when it is counting without knowing that it's counting. Everything is an experience of the beauty of living mathematics that's pulsing with life. Mathematics is not like some dead abstract subject like it's taught. That's why most people hate mathematics and are bad at mathematics, because you're taught mathematics not as it truly is, as the pulse of life, but like they're trying to make you into some kind of dead living machine like a calculator. That's why mathematics is so hated and why people are so bad at it, is because you're taught, it's like going to school to learn painting, and you want to learn how to create masterpieces, but instead you're taught how to paint fences. Of course that's going to be boring, dead, and shit. No, mathematics is not dead. It is alive. It is the pulse, the fabric of reality itself. It's what allows us to create art, experience each other, and ultimately build a beautiful, new, divine world. I want to give a big shout out to all the supporters on Patreon. And here are some of our awesome top supporters like Kure Kumo, Timothy, Rex, Naruda, Rupfu, Renaissance Fairy, and all our top supporters. If you just signed up and you don't see your name up there yet, I'm busy. I'll be updating that soon. But thank you guys so much. If you want to support on Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MorgueOfficial. It's the best way to support my work because of all the deplatforming on social media. And you'll get access to our secret weekly live stream, some of my lecture notes, a lot of excellent things. And thank you for your support.